Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
It's great to be here.
Today, we are taking on, well, the source code, the operating system of the United
Oh,
States.
that's a good way to put it.
But before you have a flashback to high school civics and, immediately tune out, I want to be really clear, we are not doing a history lesson.
No, definitely not.
We are not going to talk about cherry trees or wooden teeth.
Please, no wooden teeth. I can't handle it.
We are looking at a specific text, The Penguin Guide to the United States Constitution by Richard Beeman. This book is fantastic because it collects the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution itself, and key selections from the Federalist Papers, all with Beeman's annotations.
And our mission for this deep dive is to strip away the mythology.
Exactly. The marble statues, the reverence, this idea that these documents are some kind of sacred scripture that just dropped from heaven.
Right. We need to treat them as what they are. Engineering schematics, a blueprint for a machine.
A machine designed in 1787. And we want to know how the gears grind against each other. We want to see where the oil goes and, critically, where the friction is intentional.
And that intentional friction, that's everything. It leads us right to the title of this deep dive, Crisis in Perception.
Explain that. What's the crisis?
The crisis is that we tend to correct a fundamental error in how we view the news, how we view our own political reality. We look at all the chaos, the gridlock, the vetoes, government shutdowns, these fierce court battles, and we see it as a malfunction.
We think the system is broken.
We say it all the time. Washington is broken. But if you actually look at the blueprints,
The schematics.
you realize that a lot of the time, the chaos is the system operating exactly as it was designed to. The friction isn't a bug.
It's the primary feature.
It's the whole point.
Okay, so let's open up those blueprints. Let's start with section 1, the primary system design. And the first thing Beeman points out, which is so important, is that you can't understand the design of this new machine unless you understand the old one they were trying to replace.
The Articles of Confederation.
Right. Which, it just sounds like a boring prelude, but Beeman makes it clear it was an absolute disaster, wasn't it?
Oh, a complete and utter failure. He calls it a league of friendship, which was literally the language from the text.
A firm league of friendship.
Imagine trying to run a country based on a friendship bracelet.
Yeah.
Just, it's not a government. The Articles were basically a treaty between 13 sovereign nations that just happened to be next to each other.
And what could that government not do?
Well, almost anything that mattered. They couldn't tax directly. They had to go hat in hand to the states and say, please, sir, can we have some money? And the states would just say no.
So no money for an army, no money for anything.
Right. They couldn't coordinate defense effectively. And maybe worst of all, they couldn't regulate commerce between the states. So if New York wanted to slap a huge tax on goods coming in from New Jersey, they could. It was basically economic cannibalism.
A race to the bottom.
Total chaos. So the framers, they all go to Philadelphia in 1787. They are absolutely clear on one thing. The friendship model is broken. They need a supreme law.
But, and this is the crucial design constraint, they are absolutely terrified of concentrated power. They just fought a whole war against a king.
That's the ghost haunting the entire convention. King George III. They don't want another one.
So they have this design paradox. How do you create a government strong enough to actually govern, but weak enough that it can't tyrannize you?
And the solution they came up with is separation of powers. Now, that's a term we hear all the time. It's almost a cliche.
Right, checks and balances.
But Beeman emphasizes that we usually misunderstand it. We hear checks and balances, and we think it means cooperation, like everyone's holding hands and double-checking the math together.
It sounds so
Collaborative.
It absolutely does not mean cooperation. It means separation. It means competition. Think of it less like a relay race where they're smoothly passing a baton.
And more like a cage match where they're actively trying to tackle each other before they can cross the finish line. Exactly. The inefficiency is the entire point.
That's so counterintuitive to how we think about designing things today. We want efficiency. We want things to be fast.
But efficiency in government is incredibly dangerous. An efficient government means a dictator can wake up one morning, decide he wants to seize your farm, and have the army there by lunchtime.
And if efficiency buys you time.
It buys you due process.
Yeah.
It buys you deliberation. So they intentionally built a machine designed to grind its own gears.
Okay, so let's look at the gears. Article 1, the legislature. Beeman points out, this is Article I for a reason, they saw it as the main event.
The first branch. The center of gravity for the whole system.
But even inside this first branch, they immediately introduce friction. bicameralism,
Two houses.
the House and the Senate. Now, today we just see them as the two parts of Congress, but Beeman explains that originally they were designed to be almost different species of political animal.
Completely different. You can almost see it as a class warfare mechanism baked right into the design.
House.
Well, you have the House of Representatives. It was designed to be the great repository of the people. 2-year terms, constant elections. It's meant to be rowdy, immediate, emotional.
The pulse of the public.
Right. If the public is angry about something, the House should be angry about it that afternoon. It's the eye of the country. Get a little Freudian.
Okay, if the House is the eyed, what's the Senate?
The Senate is the superego.
The cool calculating.
The Senate was designed for the virtuous. And we have to be clear, in 1787, virtuous was code. It meant the landed gentry, the educated, the wealthy, the establishment.
But crucially, you didn't even vote for them, not directly.
Right, and this is a detail that I think just blows people's minds. Until the 17th Amendment in 1913, senators were chosen by the state legislatures.
Not by the people.
Exactly. They were deliberately insulated from the whims of the people. Their job was to look at the House, which is, screaming about some new populist rage, and to calmly say no.
Beeman alludes to that famous story, maybe apocryphal, with George Washington and Jefferson.
By coffee saucer story, yeah. Jefferson comes back from France and asks why they created a Senate. Washington supposedly points to Jefferson's coffee cup and asks, "Why did you pour your coffee into the saucer?"
And Jefferson says, to cool it.
Even so, Washington replies, "We pour legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it." The Senate is a heat sink. It's designed to kill bad ideas, but
It also kills good ideas if they're too fast or too radical.
that's the price of stability. So right there, inside the branch that makes the laws, you have a mechanism designed to fight with itself.
But here's where the systems view gets really interesting. When you actually look at the text of Article 1, as Beeman points out, it is incredibly specific. It's a laundry list.
A very long laundry list.
Congress can borrow money, regulate commerce, coin money, establish post offices, declare war. It goes on and on.
It's an enumerated list of powers. Very deliberate.
But then you flip the page to Article 2, the executive, and Article 3, the judiciary, and
Yeah.
it's like the framers just ran out of ink.
It becomes maddeningly, shockingly vague.
So why? Was it just late in the summer in Philadelphia and they were tired and wanted to go home?
I mean, part of it was probably exhaustion, sure, but Beeman argues it was also a feature. Part of it was fear.
Yeah.
They knew what a legislature looked like. They had the British Parliament as a model. They didn't really know what a president was supposed to be.
They just knew what it wasn't supposed to be.
It wasn't supposed to be a king. So Article 2 just says, the executive power shall be vested in a president.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah.
It doesn't define executive power.
It's a huge blank check.
A massive one.
Ah.
And Beeman highlights what he calls the missing cabinet. The Constitution doesn't even create the government as we know it.
What do you mean?
There's no mention of a State Department or a Treasury Department or a Department of War. It just hints that the president might have some principal officers in various departments.
So the first Congress had to actually build the machine.
They had to show up and invent the executive branch from scratch. The Constitution is less like a finished building and more like a zoning permit.
That's a great analogy. It grants the authority to build, but it doesn't tell you where to put the plumbing.
And that vagueness in Articles 2 and 3, it turned out to be a really important feature. It allowed the executive and the judiciary to expand and adapt over 200 years. If they had defined the presidency too strictly in 1787, the office probably wouldn't have survived the Civil War or the Great Depression.
Okay, so we have the harbor structure, separation, intentional friction, deliberate vagueness. But a machine doesn't run without physics. We need to talk about the why, the incentive.
The motivation.
And this brings us to, well, the holy grail of American political theory, Federalist number 51.
James Madison. If you read nothing else from this entire period, you have to read Federalist 51. It's the user manual for the American government.
This is where we get that famous line, maybe the most famous line of all. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary.
But men are not angels. And, crucially, the people running the government are not angels either. They're just as flawed and ambitious as the rest of us.
So how do you design a system for non-angels?
You don't rely on virtue. That's the key. You don't hope you elect good guys. You assume you're going to elect ambitious, self-interested people, and you use that. Madison's core incentive structure is ambition must be made to counteract ambition.
It is so deeply cynical, but it's also brilliant.
It's pure engineering.
Yeah.
You distribute power across these different branches so that no single actor can ever dominate. You assume the president will be power hungry. You assume the Senate will be arrogant. You assume the House will be reckless.
And you arrange them on the field so that their individual greed for power forces them to check the other guy's greed.
It's like a political Mexican standoff.
Or mutually assured destruction applied to legislation.
Madison's phrase is, "The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place." You make it in a senator's personal best interest to protect the power of the Senate.
So the outcome of this whole design isn't efficiency. It's what Beeman calls the double security.
Right. It's a two-level security system. Level one,
Yeah.
you divide power between the state governments and the federal government. That's the vertical split.
Federalism.
And then level two, you subdivide the federal government itself into three branches: legislative, executive, judicial security. That's the horizontal split.
It's a gridlock machine. It's designed to be difficult.
It's a machine that requires a very broad consensus to move forward. If you can't get the House, the Senate, and the president to agree, which requires aligning a massive amount of competing ambition, then the machine just does nothing.
And for the framers, doing nothing was often safer than doing the wrong thing.
Absolutely. That is a massive shift in perception for us today. We see gridlock and we think failure. Madison sees gridlock and thinks safety.
Silence is stability.
In many ways, yes.
Let's move to the next layer then. We have the blueprint. Now let's look at the incentive architecture in more detail. We talked about ambition in general, but Beeman dives into some very specific mechanisms. How do you actually force these people to fight each other?
You give them weapons and you give them shields.
Okay, let's start with a weapon. The big one for the House of Representatives.
The power of the purse. You find it in Article 1, Section 7.
All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives.
So why the House? Why not the Senate? Or why not let them both do it?
Beeman connects this directly back to the slogan of the revolution.
No taxation without representation.
Exactly. The single specific grievance that, more than any other, caused the war was taxation without consent. The colonists were furious about being taxed by a parliament where they had no elected members.
So the framers hardwired the solution. The House is the people's body. It was the only part of the federal government that was directly elected in the original version. The logic was, if you're going to reach into the people's pockets and take their money,
You better be the one who has to face those people in an election every 2 years.
it's pure, direct accountability. If you tax us too much, we will fire you in 24 months. The Senate, with its 6-year terms and appointment by states, was too insulated to be trusted with that power.
Okay, so that's a weapon for the House. Now let's talk about a shield, the one for the judiciary.
Article 3. We mentioned it's vague, but it has one structural beam that is made of pure titanium, tenure,
During good behavior.
which has been interpreted to mean life tenure. As long as you don't commit a high crime or misdemeanor, you have the job until you die or retire.
And Alexander Hamilton writes about this in Federalist number 78.
He argues that this permanent tenure is the only way to make the judiciary truly independent. It's the only way to destroy their dependence on the other branches.
Dependence on the president who appointed them or the Senate that confirmed them.
Exactly. I mean, just think about the incentive structure. If a Supreme Court justice had to be reappointed every 5 or 10 years, how would they rule?
They'd be constantly looking over their shoulder.
They would rule in a way that pleases the president or the current majority in the Senate so they could keep their job. The law would become secondary to political survival.
But if they have the job for life,
They can bite the hand that fed them. Once they put on that robe, they owe the president who appointed them absolutely nothing. Hamilton wanted them completely insulated from political pressure so they could be faithful guardians of the Constitution.
and there's another layer of insulation that Beeman notes, a really clever one, their salary.
Yes, Congress controls the budget. They set the salaries for everyone, including judges. But the Constitution says Congress cannot diminish a judge's salary during their continuance in office.
That is such a specific, almost petty-sounding detail.
But it's crucial. It's an anti-coercion device. It prevents Congress from saying, hey, we really didn't like your ruling on that contract case, Justice Smith, so we've decided next year your salary is going to be $1.
It's a shield. It forces the branches to fight using their constitutional tools like impeachment or passing new laws, not by trying to starve each other out.
Exactly. It creates financial independence. And all this brings us back to the overall outcome of this incentive architecture. what we can call negotiated constraint,
Meaning things only get done through compromise.
or through a stalemate being broken. Outcomes laws, budgets, appointments only happen when the ambitions of these different branches happen to align, or when one is forced into a compromise by the power of another.
It's stability via selfishness. The system functions not because people are good, but because their private interests keeping their job, protecting their salary, expanding their institutional turf acts as a sentinel over the public rights.
That is the entire Madisonian gamble. You don't try to change human nature, you leverage it. You build a machine that runs on ambition as its fuel.
All right, let's switch gears. We have the machine and we have the fuel. Now let's talk about the software, the narrative and legitimization layer. Because a machine is useless if people don't believe in it, if they don't buy into the project.
And this is where Beeman spends a lot of time on the Declaration of Independence.
Which feels strange at first because it's not a legal document. It has no force of law.
Right, but it acts as the mission statement. It's the moral and philosophical preamble to the whole system. And Beeman analyzes the Declaration not just as a beautiful piece of poetry or a national anthem, but as a legal brief.
Jefferson the lawyer, making his case to the world.
He was a very good lawyer. And the Declaration is structured as an indictment. It lists 27 specific grievances. It's a charge sheet. He has kept among us in times of peace, standing armies. He has cut off our trade. He has imposed taxes on us without our consent.
But notice who the he is in all of those sentences.
It's the king, King George III. And this, Beeman points out, is a massive systems-level shift in strategy for the colonists. For a decade, they had been complaining about Parliament. They were sending petitions to London saying Parliament is breaking the rules of the British Constitution.
They still saw themselves as British subjects arguing about their rights.
Exactly. But by 1776, Jefferson changes the target. He ignores Parliament and goes directly for the head. He targets the king. This signals the complete severance of the social contract.
They're saying, we aren't British subjects arguing about laws anymore. We are a separate people breaking up with our monarch.
It's a declaration of divorce. And in doing so, it shifts the source of sovereignty.
From the crown to
the people, which leads us directly to the first three words of the Constitution's preamble.
We the people.
As opposed to we the states.
And that distinction was explosive at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Patrick Henry, who was a passionate anti-federalist and opponent of the Constitution, he read that preamble and he freaked out. He stood up in the Virginia Ratifying Convention and said, who authorized them to speak the language of we the people instead of we the states?
He saw it as a revolutionary power grab.
Because it was. It was a declaration that this new government's authority came directly from the citizens, not as a gift from the state governments. And this brings us to the process of ratification, which Beeman covers in his 4th chapter. I love this part of the history because it feels less like a dry civics lesson and more like a political heist movie.
A political heist, I like that. So what was the heist?
Okay, think about the situation. The law of the land is the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles explicitly say that to make any changes, you need unanimous approval from all 13 state legislatures.
Which was never going to happen. Rhode Island didn't even bother to send delegates to Philadelphia.
Never. The framers knew they would never get unanimity. And more importantly, they knew the state legislatures themselves would never vote for this new Constitution.
Why not?
Because the new Constitution took a huge amount of power away from the states and gave it to the new federal government. Asking the state legislatures to approve it was like asking a room full of CEOs to vote for their own demotion and a massive pay cut.
They had a vested self-interest in the status quo.
Of course they did. So what did the framers do?
They cheated.
That's a strong word, but yeah, basically, they changed the rules of the game while the game was being played. They wrote Article 7 of their own new document, the Constitution, which said, hey, you know that whole unanimity rule? We're ignoring it.
So what was the new rule?
The new rule was, we don't need all 13 states. We only need 9. And by the way, we're not asking the legislatures. We are creating a whole new device, state ratifying conventions.
They bypassed the entire existing political structure.
They went right over the heads of the professional politicians and took the case directly to the people, or at least to special delegates elected, just for this one purpose. It was a brilliant, audacious maneuver to get around institutional inertia and self-interest.
And on top of that, they pulled off what has to be the greatest rebranding campaign in political history.
The Federalist name.
This still confuses people today, because we think of federalism as a system where states have a lot of power.
Right. In 1787, the common understanding of a federalist was someone who wanted a loose confederation of sovereign states, which is exactly what the opponents of the new Constitution believed in.
But the guys who wanted a strong, powerful central government, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, they stole the name.
They just swiped it. They called themselves Federalists, which was genius because it forced their opponents, the actual Federalists, into the position of having to call themselves anti-Federalists.
It's like a club of avid meat eaters deciding to call themselves the vegetarians.
And forcing the actual vegetarians to campaign as the anti-vegetarians. It's brilliant. It defined their opposition by a negative. It allowed the centralizers to wrap themselves in the warm, fuzzy, familiar blanket of federalism while they were actually dismantling the old federal system.
And a huge part of that PR campaign was the Federalist Papers.
Which, as Beeman notes, we now treat like holy writ. Lawyers cite them in Supreme Court arguments constantly as if they are a definitive guide to the framers' intent.
But at the time, they were just op-eds.
They were deadline content. They were political editorials written for a very specific purpose, to persuade the voters of New York to ratify the Constitution. Hamilton and Madison were just cranking these things out at a feverish pace to win a political fight.
Beeman points out that in the 19th century, the Supreme Court hardly ever cited them. It wasn't until the 20th century that the citations just skyrocketed.
That's right. So the outcome here is this creation of interpretive continuity. We've retroactively elevated these op-eds into a canonical text to give the system an intellectual and historical legitimacy that it manufactured for itself.
And this allows for what you could call reinterpretation as preservation.
Explain that.
Well, look at the phrase, all men are created equal from the Declaration. In 1776, that was an unfulfilled promise. In a slaveholding society, it was, frankly, a lie. But the narrative layer, the story we tell, allowed that phrase to survive.
And to evolve.
Exactly. It shifted from a rhetorical flourish to a binding legal standard over centuries, culminating in cases like Brown v. Board of Education. The narrative holds the country together while the actual meaning of the words shifts dramatically underneath it.
That is the legitimization layer. The software code, the story we tell ourselves to keep the machine running.
So now let's look at the engine itself. Section 4. Operational mechanisms. How does this thing actually move and do things?
The engine runs on authority and money. And the biggest single upgrade from the Articles to the Constitution is taxation. Article 1, Section 8. The power to lay and collect taxes directly from the people.
No more going to the states and asking nicely for an allowance.
Right. This is the federal government getting its own wallet. If you control the revenue, you define the scope and power of the government. But the transmission of this engine, what connects the power to the wheels, is the Supremacy Clause.
Article 6. It says the Constitution and the federal laws made under it are the supreme law of the land.
This basically says if a state law and a federal law get into a fight, the federal law wins. End of story.
Well, in theory. But in practice, you need a referee who decides if the laws are actually in conflict. And this is where we get to probably the most important single operational mechanism of all, judicial review.
Marbury v. Madison.
1803. We really have to slow down and unpack this one, because as Beeman says, this case is the moment the software really came online. He calls it a bold leap.
It's a political thriller, really. The context is everything.
So set the scene for us. What's happening in Washington in 1801?
Okay. It's the election of 1800, which was vicious. The Federalists, led by President John Adams, have just lost. And they lost badly. Thomas Jefferson and his party, the Democratic Republicans, are about to take over the presidency and the Congress.
So the Federalists are terrified. They're about to be completely out of power.
Right. So in the final weeks of their administration, literally the final hours, they decide to pack the one branch of government they can still control, the judiciary.
These are the infamous midnight judges.
Exactly. Adams appoints dozens of loyal Federalists to judicial posts to create a kind of Federalist firewall inside the government. One of these guys is a man named William Marbury. The Senate confirms him. President Adams signs his commission. But, and this is the key, in the chaos of the final night, the physical paper commission doesn't get delivered to him.
So Jefferson takes office the next day. His new Secretary of State, James Madison, walks in and sees this stack of undelivered papers on the desk.
And Jefferson says, essentially, throw them in the trash. I'm not giving jobs to my political enemies.
So Marbury sues. He goes directly to the Supreme Court and says, the law says I have this job. Make the president give me my commission.
Now here is the brilliant trap. The Chief Justice is a man named John Marshall,
who is a Federalist himself. appointed by Adams.
And he hates his cousin, Thomas Jefferson. They absolutely despise each other.
Hmm?
But Marshall is in an impossible bind. If he orders Jefferson to deliver the commission, what will Jefferson do?
He'll just laugh and ignore the order.
And the Supreme Court has no army. It has no police force. It has no enforcement power. If the president openly defies the court is revealed as powerless, a paper tiger. It's game over for the judiciary as a co-equal branch.
Okay, so that's option one. What if Marshall rules against Marbury?
Then he looks like a coward who buckled to political pressure from Jefferson. He would be admitting that the president is, in fact, above the law.
It's a lose-lose, a checkmate.
It looks like it. But what Marshall does is pure political genius. He writes this massive, sprawling opinion. For the first 80% of it, he just lectures Jefferson. He says, Marbury is right. He is entitled to his commission. You are violating the law. You're acting shamefully.
He's asserting the court's moral dominance.
He is. He's winning the argument.
Mm-hmm.
But then, in the final few paragraphs, he pulls off an incredible pivot. He says, however, the law that allowed Mr. Marbury to come directly to the Supreme Court to file this lawsuit, that law is unconstitutional.
Wait, what? A law passed by Congress?
He says, Congress passed a law, the Judiciary Act of 1789, that gave us the power to hear this kind of case. But the Constitution in Article 3 defines our power, and Congress can't expand our power beyond what the Constitution says. Therefore, that law is void. I'm sorry, Mr. Marbury, we have no jurisdiction. Case dismissed.
That is absolutely brilliant. He sacrificed the pawn to capture the king's castle.
Precisely. He gave up the minor power to hear that specific case in order to seize a much, much bigger power. The power for the Supreme Court to strike down acts of Congress. He single-handedly established the principle of judicial review.
And Jefferson couldn't do anything about it because technically Jefferson won the case.
Right. Jefferson got what he wanted. Marbury didn't get the job, so he couldn't very well fight the ruling. But Marshall planted a flag that day that said, for the first time, it is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is.
So this is political survival translating into a massive institutional gain.
And the long-term outcome is the formalization of conflict. Instead of partisan disputes leading to coups or armed rebellions, they become legal cases. Marbury was a vicious partisan fight, but it was ultimately resolved by lawyers reading a document in a quiet room. Disagreement is channeled into procedural debates about jurisdiction and constitutionality.
So the engine is running. But engines generate heat, and they change over time. Let's talk about Section 5. Feedback loops. How does the system evolve without breaking?
The system has this built-in perpetual tension between the center and the periphery. On one side, you have the 10th Amendment.
The States' Rights Amendment.
Right. It says, powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states. It's the anchor for state power.
But on the other side, you have the Necessary and Proper Clause in Article 1, Section 8.
The elastic clause. It says Congress can make any law necessary and proper for carrying into execution its listed powers. And that clause, it stretches.
And the history of the U.S. is largely the history of that elastic band stretching further and further, usually in favor of the federal government.
It is. And this brings us back to another key text, Federalist Number 10, and Madison's idea of the extended republic.
This is another one of those really counterintuitive ideas from the period. Most political theorists at the time, drawing on Montesquieu, thought that a republic had to be small, like a Greek city-state. If it gets too big, it falls apart under its own weight.
And Madison argued the exact opposite.
Yeah.
He said, extend the sphere, make the country huge, include more territory, more people, more competing interests.
Why is bigger better?
Because of factions. Madison was obsessed with the danger of factions. He knew that people formed tribes based on religion, economics, geography. In a small republic, like a single state, it's easy for one faction to become a majority.
Tyranny of the majority.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In a small town of 100 people, if 51 of them decide they want to ban dancing and seize the property of the 49 dancers, they can do it easily. A majority faction is dangerous to liberty.
So how does making the country bigger solve that?
Because if you have a massive republic stretching from the farms of Georgia to the shipping ports of Massachusetts, you have so many different factions. You have farmers, merchants, manufacturers, creditors, debtors, Anglicans, Baptists, Quakers. It becomes almost impossible for any single faction to form a durable majority and dominate everyone else.
You dilute the
You dilute the violence of faction by forcing them all to negotiate and compromise with each other. And this created a feedback loop of centralization over time. As the country got bigger and more complex, the federal government had to take on a larger role to manage that extended sphere.
And Beeman points to the courts and their expansion of interpretation as a key part of this feedback loop, specifically how they use the 14th Amendment.
This is the case of Gitlow v. New York, 1925. This is absolutely crucial for understanding modern America. Before this case, the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, religion, and so on, was understood to apply only to the federal government.
Wait, say that again? So a state could, in theory, ban free speech.
Yes, and they did, for over a century. The First Amendment starts with the words, Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say, the New York legislature shall make no law. Massachusetts had an official state religion for decades after the Constitution was ratified.
That's incredible. So what changed with Gitlow?
So Benjamin Gitlow was a socialist who was arrested in New York for distributing pamphlets advocating the overthrow of the government. He is convicted under a state law. He appealed, and the Supreme Court looked at the 14th Amendment.
Which was passed after the Civil War to protect the rights of newly freed slaves.
Right. And it has this clause that says, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And in Gitlow, the court said that the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment includes the freedom of speech from the First Amendment.
So they incorporated the First Amendment and applied it against the states.
Exactly. They used the feedback loop of the 14th Amendment to say, actually, states have to follow most of the Bill of Rights, too. It was a massive revolutionary expansion of federal judicial power into the affairs of the states.
And it shows how the system processes crisis. Radicalism, like socialists in the 1920s, gets absorbed and processed through the court system, and the system adapts.
And in doing so, it creates path dependency. Each one of these major rulings, Marbury, Gitlow, Brown v. Board, it lays down another brick in the road. Future courts have to walk on that path. The system grows and changes, but it grows according to the internal logic of its own previous decisions.
It's evolutionary, not revolutionary.
Precisely.
Which begs the question, why hasn't it collapsed? Section 6, persistence analysis. We've had a brutal civil war, the Great Depression, world wars. Why does this 230-year-old document survive when so many other systems fail?
The first reason is risk distribution. Federalism, for all its problems, diffuses risk. If the government of Illinois fails or goes bankrupt or becomes deeply corrupt, it doesn't collapse the United States. As Beeman notes, no single actor ever controls the whole system.
It's compartmentalized, like a modern ship with watertight bulkheads. If one section floods, the rest of the ship can still float.
That's a perfect metaphor. And then there is simple inertia, Article V, the amendment process.
It is notoriously, legendarily difficult to amend the Constitution.
It is almost impossible. You need a two-thirds vote of both houses of Congress, and then you need that to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That is a staggeringly high bar to clear.
Beeman points out there have only been 27 amendments in our entire history, and 10 of those came all at once right at the beginning, the Bill of Rights.
So really, we've only successfully changed the code 17 times in over 230 years.
And what does that difficulty do to the system?
It discourages hot rewrites. In many other countries, if a new party wins a big landslide election, their first act might be to rewrite the Constitution to favor themselves. In the U.S., you can't. The bar is too high. So you're forced to adapt through reinterpretation instead.
So because we can't easily change the text, we are forced to change the reading of the text.
Which is a much safer, more stable way to evolve. It absorbs critique without breaking. Look at the nullification crisis in the early 19th century. Jefferson and Madison, yes, the same Madison, wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in 1798, arguing that states could nullify federal laws they didn't like.
A direct challenge to the Supremacy Clause.
A fundamental challenge to the whole system. But the system eventually rejected the idea of nullification. It absorbed that dissatisfaction into the election of 1800. Jefferson won the presidency, the hated Alien and Sedition Acts expired, and the crisis passed without the system breaking.
It transforms revolution into rotation. You don't burn down the palace, you just peacefully change the tenant who lives there.
And that stability emerges from that structured tension. Because everyone is constantly fighting for their little piece of power, no one can ever grab the whole pie at once.
This brings us right back to the core theme of the book and our deep dive. Section 7, Interconnection and the Crisis in Perception.
This is the system's view in a nutshell. The crisis in perception is that we mistake the noise of politics for the machine being broken. When we see gridlock on the news, we panic. We think nothing is getting done, the government is stalled, it's failed.
But if we understand the design...
We understand that ambition counteracting ambition looks like conflict. It sounds like a nasty argument. but it acts like stability. If the president wants to do something potentially dangerous and Congress stops him and the courts get involved, that is not a bug. That is the machine working perfectly.
The friction is the feature.
And we have to realize that these constitutional disputes are nested systems. They're not just abstract legal logic problems. They are nested within partisan competition. Marbury v. Madison happened because Federalists and Republicans were locked in a death match for control of the country.
And it's nested within economic pressures.
Absolutely. Federalist Number 10 is explicitly about the conflict between debtors and creditors, between property owners and those without property.
So you can't just look at a Supreme Court decision in a vacuum. You have to look at the entire political and economic ecosystem that produced it.
Exactly. A fragmented analysis, where you only look at one piece at a time, leads to panic and confusion. A systems analysis reveals a process of adaptation.
So let's bring it home. Section 8, present-day implications. What does this all mean for us today? Because we are definitely living through some noise right now.
The structural logic of 1787 is still running the show. I mean, look at the modern debates over the use of executive orders. Why do presidents from both parties increasingly rely on them?
Because Congress is gridlocked and they can't get laws passed.
Exactly. And why is Congress gridlocked? Because of the design friction between the populous House and the deliberative Senate. So the president uses the vagueness of Article 2 to act alone. And then what happens immediately after?
Someone sues and it ends up in the courts.
And the cycle continues. The incentive architecture is still in place. Politicians still protect their institutional turf. When Congress launches an investigation into the executive branch, they aren't necessarily doing it because they are virtuous sentinels of the Republic.
They're doing it because of Federalist 51. They're protecting their own power and relevance from a rival branch.
It's comforting in a very weird, cynical way. They're often acting for selfish institutional reasons, but the systemic result is a check on concentrated power.
And finally, let's talk about the Supreme Court today. Hamilton, in Federalist Number 78, famously called it the least dangerous branch.
He said it had neither force nor will, but merely judgment.
That seems like a massive underestimation from our perspective.
The feedback loop that John Marshall initiated in Marbury, that bold leap, has, over 2 centuries, made the court a primary policymaker in American life. It decides fundamental questions about healthcare, marriage, reproduction, the environment.
The system has evolved to place immense, almost unimaginable weight on those 9 unelected justices.
Which explains why every single nomination is now treated as a total political war. The stakes are just that high.
But the final thought here, the one that Beeman really leaves us with, is that the outcomes we get are shaped less by who is in charge lists, by the character of the enlightened statesman Madison warned us not to rely on, and more by the incentives embedded in the design of the machine itself.
The machine tends to run regardless of who is at the controls. To a point, the system assumes the operators will be ambitious. It assumes they will fight for their power. As long as they fight within the rules of the structure holds.
That is a powerful and strangely calming way to look at the daily news. When you see the fighting, don't just despair. Remember the design. Remember the purpose of the friction.
Ambition must be made to counteract ambition.
That's the design. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the blueprint of 1787 to the feedback loops of the 21st century.
It's a complex and fascinating machine.
It is, and we hope this systems-level view helps you see the gears turning behind the headlines. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
Thanks for listening.
Catch you in the next deep dive.